Herman. I am the principal investigator of the National Science Foundation Research Coordination Network on Arctic migrations that is hosting this webinar, and a senior fellow at the Arctic Institute. I am so honored to be facilitating this webinar today on Arctic science diplomacy with two incredible scholars, Mr. Pavel Devyatkin and Dr. Katerina Uryupova. We are going to hear two amazing presentations today. The first on the history of U.S. Russia Arctic science diplomacy, and the second on the intersection and governance of scientific and naval operations in the Arctic. I will be monitoring the chat throughout both of these presentations. So if you have any technical difficulties or questions for our two presenters, please make sure to type them in the chat and I will make sure to help you. We will first hear from Pavel, and then I will call up Katya and bring both of them back onto our screen for a moderated discussion. So again, I ask that if you have any questions for either of our speakers, to please put those in the chat as they are presenting. If you have to leave early and are unable to stay for our question and answer session, we are recording this entire webinar and we'll send out that link after our event today. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. And I will hand off my virtual microphone to Pavel for our first presentation. Over to you, Pavel.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Thank you for everyone joining us today for our webinar. Can you see my screen all right? Great. So my presentation is going to be on U.S. Russia relations in the Arctic, particularly on science cooperation. I've done a lot of research in this area. I'm joining this webinar from Moscow. And so I've been talking about this topic with colleagues in the West and in Russia. And so it's an ongoing and an exciting topic of the history, current state, and future prospects of U.S. Russia cooperation in the Arctic, particularly science diplomacy. So since my presentation is about science cooperation and diplomacy, I'd like to start by introducing this term, science diplomacy. It doesn't have one straightforward definition, but it's been generally separated into three fundamental dimensions. Science in diplomacy, which is science that informs foreign policy. Diplomacy for science, which is foreign policy which facilitates science cooperation. And science for diplomacy, which is science cooperation to purposefully improve diplomatic relations. So the US and Russia actually have a long history of scientific dialogue. This began to influence diplomatic relations between the two countries as early as the 18th century. In a letter to Mikhail Lomonosov, dated February 20th, 1765, Benjamin Franklin, together with Ezra Stiles, asked his polymathic Russian counterpart for an account of the discoveries of the polar voyage. The Lomonosov, famous Russian scientist, had taken part in the Great Northern Expedition and written extensively about oceanography and the aurora borealis. And though it's unclear whether Lomonosov ever received this dispatch and the interaction was not necessarily a form of science diplomacy, the correspondence indicated that eminent American and Russian scientists were interested in sharing findings even before the US declared independence. And soon after this contact, the countries went on to engage in numerous exchanges throughout the 19th century. Both countries sent scientists to participate in major multilateral projects, including the Magnetic Crusade, and such initiatives helped to establish a precedent for international scientific collaboration and were particularly important for bringing European countries together during this period of rising tension that would eventually erupt into the Franco-Prussian War. So even during the 18th century, there was an early form of science cooperation. A lot of people point to the International Polar Year as a prime example in this period. The US and Russia joined about 10 other countries between 1882 and 1883 in the International Polar Year to collect data on Arctic sea ice, meteorology, and the aurora borealis. So the IPY was inspired by the Austro-Hungarian explorer Karl Weiprecht, who was a strong advocate of international expeditions. He said that when countries that consider themselves to be advanced in terms of scientific progress decide to work together, they completely eliminate any national competition. So instead of competing, Weiprecht called on countries to collaborate. And so such language is very indicative of science for diplomacy. During the IPY, research stations were constructed across the Arctic, including in Nova Zemlya and in Point Barrow, places that today would be considered militarily sensitive, something that Katya will talk about later. The simultaneous observations that went on during the IPY on the aurora borealis confirmed Weiprecht's thesis that large-scale collaboration was possible, and that multilateral initiatives were important for shaping the attitudes towards transnational science in the US and Russia. And this set a precedent for further collaborations. And these included the second IPY in the 1930s, which was organized during a period of low solar activity to contrast with the first IPY's active solar period. And despite the IPY being poorly funded because it went on during the Great Depression of the 20s and 30s, the second IPY furthered understanding of magnetism, atmospheric science, and the ionosphere. And these initiatives set the stage for a deepening of cooperation even during the Cold War. But of course, these collaborations were initially hindered by political differences and geopolitical rivalry. So during the Cold War between the US and Soviet Union, there was this new atmosphere of political struggle where the environment was another battlefield of ideological competition. Virtuous ecological achievements were highlighted to show one socio-political system's advantages over the other. International concerns from non-aligned countries over environmental degradation played a major role in pressuring the superpowers to demonstrate their system's environmentalist superiority, as well as develop mutually advantageous forms of cooperation. During this period, Arctic residents, indigenous peoples, scholars, civil societies, and NGOs became concerned with environmental protection, particularly after experiencing air and water pollution that largely originated from the lower latitudes. So there's this history of external pressure on states that perhaps could present a lesson to us today when we're talking about how to restore cooperation or in what direction cooperation in the Arctic is going. There were several agreements between the US and USSR that were related to Arctic science diplomacy. The 1972 Nixon-Brezhnev Agreement on Cooperation in the Field of Environmental Protection particularly named the Arctic and subarctic ecological systems as focus areas for the exchange of scientists, exchange of scientific and technical information, and joint development and implementation of programs. Another example was the 1973 agreement on the conservation of polar bears, and during the 1986 and 1988 Reagan-Gorbachev summits in Reykjavik and Moscow, there was high-level discussion of these ecological concerns as well. The joint statement from the 1988 Moscow summit reaffirmed the leaders' support for expanded bilateral and regional contacts and increased scientific and environmental cooperation. So this is diplomacy for science, which supported science cooperation. And one example was a joint research report titled Prospects for Future Climate. There's a picture of the report on the slides. And this work helped alert scientists to rising temperatures and changing weather in the high latitudes. The work went on during the 80s, but it was published in 1990. And there were valuable findings that were produced that would arguably not have been achieved had the research been conducted unilaterally. As the Cold War came to an end, relations between scientists proved to be a significant source of trust building that eventually spilled over into the political and military spheres. And this was in the form of arms reduction talks. US, Soviet, Russia tensions were eased towards the end of the Cold War, and scientific cooperation started entering more sensitive fields such as oceanography and natural resources. And although we're living under different political conditions to those of the Cold War, it's noteworthy that such agreements were able to be implemented under such high political tensions. And in this way, lots of scholars and politicians point to this period to start thinking about and planning for what direction cooperation could go in this day. So the aforementioned examples of collaboration lay the foundation for a contemporary form of science diplomacy between the US and Russia. After the Cold War, the easing of tensions prompted the US and Russia to increase funding for scientific projects and exchanges. And I'll share a few examples. One example is the Nansen and Amundsen Basins Observation System, or NABOS. NABOS is an Arctic expeditionary program involving dozens of scientists, mostly from the US and Russia. Since the program began in 2002, there have been 13 expeditions, the most recent in the fall of 2021 aboard the Russian ice-class research vessel Akademik Troshnikov. It's been funded by the National Science Foundation, by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, and the Russian Federal Service for Hydrometeorology and Environmental Protection. NABOS monitors sea ice and the atmosphere in the eastern Arctic Ocean. And this is the setting for accelerated atmospheric warming due to an influx of warmer water from the Atlantic Ocean. The results of these cruises improved understanding of sea ice reduction. The research depended on repeated and concurrent calculations and the long-term upkeep of mooring buoys. And both were more easily achieved with international collaboration and realized through scientific diplomacy efforts. I have some quotes from some participants of NABOS. So the success of the NABOS program relies primarily upon the effective collaboration of scientists from a wide range of countries, institutions, and scientific disciplines, according to Igor Polyakov, a professor at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Vladimir Ivanov, the leading researcher at the Arctic and Antarctic Research Institute in St. Petersburg, similarly complimented the international aspect of the project. He said that mutual understanding is established quickly, and we never have any problems with communication on a working level. So NABOS is another example of collaborative research producing valuable results and building communication channels. It is excellent that we can do this together with the Russians. They are very good, helpful, friendly, and we never have a problem. We do not talk any politics, not even over the dinner table, said James Dunn, a technician from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. So participants said that NABOS is a perfect case demonstrating the importance of cooperation. Michael DeLue from the International Arctic Research Center wrote that international collaboration is the key for successful science in the Arctic, and our project, NABOS, provides solid proof for that. Rusalka, which means mermaid in Russian, is another example of a significant series of bilateral studies. The Russian-American long-term consensus of the Arctic went on from 2003 to 2015. It emerged out of a memorandum of understanding in 2003 between NOAA and the Russian Academy of Sciences. Across several expeditions to the Bering and Chukchi Seas between 2004 and 2015, Russian and American scientists studied the marine chemistry, glaciology, oceanography, and ecosystems of the Pacific Arctic. So Rusalka had the goal to understand the reduction of sea ice in the region. And the expanse held and continues to hold significance in Arctic studies as a climatically but also geopolitically sensitive area. The Bering and Chukchi Straits form a bottleneck for the transit of heat and saline water between the two basins of the Arctic and Pacific Oceans, as well as for naval vessels, most frequently submarines. At the time, Rusalka was the only science program with simultaneous access to both US and Russian maritime territories. So Rusalka stands out as a historical exemplar of US Russia Arctic science diplomacy, as it produced valuable knowledge while grappling with turbulent political tensions. The start of the program coincided with Vladimir Putin's famous 2007 speech at the Munich Security Conference, where the Russian president stressed Russia's dissatisfaction with the unipolar world, or American dominance of international politics, as well as the Russian-Georgian War of 2008. So considering that Rusalka was not concluded until several years later, the significance of the scientific findings were evidently more important than political disagreements. Alexei Ostrovsky, a Russian coordinator of Rusalka, said that since our climate research is important for all of humanity, we managed to avoid the possible negative impact on the project of some individual contradictions between politicians. There's some evidence that there was lots of opposition to Rusalka, particularly from the Russian Navy, that was skeptical of American scientists coming into Russian territories. Ostrovsky said that the scientists of the project concentrate on what unites them, that is science, and we had and still have excellent relations with our American colleagues. After 2014, sanctions and counter-sanctions ultimately led to the suspension of the expeditions, but it was interesting that in May 2014, after the Crimea crisis, the U.S. National Security Council granted an exemption in support of Rusalka's operations. But the July expedition in that year met complications, and Rusalka unfortunately came to an end. So scientific collaboration is still seen as constructive, but requires lots of careful planning to overcome barriers, particularly political barriers. And then the third case is the multidisciplinary Drifting Observatory for the Study of Arctic Climate, or MOSAIC, 2019-2020. MOSAIC stands out because of its unprecedented budget and ambitious agenda. The program was planned as a year-round expedition in the central Arctic Ocean to understand how changing sea ice cover affected ecosystems, oceans, and the atmosphere. From 2019 to 2020, scientists were trapped in sea ice aboard the German Polarstern icebreaker and resupplied with assistance from Russian, Chinese, and Swedish icebreaker vessels. The project cost approximately 140 million euros, and the expedition produced several terabytes of data and thousands of samples. The US was represented by the NSF, by NOAA, by NASA, and the Department of Energy. Russia was represented by the Arctic and Antarctic Research Institute in St. Petersburg, as well as the federal port infrastructure operator Rosmorport. The international aspect of MOSAIC was particularly critical for meeting the scientific objectives, as expertise from different nations needed to be combined. For example, the Russian Arctic and Antarctic Research Institute was invited to participate because the organization has lots of experience with drifting ice stations. And Western collaboration with Russia was crucial, according to the project manager of MOSAIC, Anya Sommerfeld, who said that in the science plan from 2016, due to the complexity of such a program and the broad regional interests, MOSAIC is an international endeavor that relies on a broad base of international participation, funding, and infrastructure, and is repeated throughout the evaluations of MOSAIC that the results of the expedition would not have been achieved through unilateral research. So through intense cooperation and mutual support, MOSAIC has accomplished much more collectively than would have been possible through individual disciplinary or national efforts. But of course, MOSAIC also faced complications in realizing its agenda, most notably related to the COVID-19 restrictions. Scientists had to confront the challenge of continuing a project that had been in planning for over a decade during an unprecedented health crisis. The pandemic-related travel bans prevented planned aerial surveys and resupply missions. The expedition prepared for contingency plans for emergencies, for example, fire on the icebreaker vessel or sudden attack from a polar bear, but there was no plan for a pandemic. The COVID-19 interrupted, but did not completely compromise the expedition. Autonomous research continued, but activities that required scientists were very much affected. So this example is a multilateral example, and the US and Russia were just part of a larger group of nations participating, and perhaps the U.S. Russia aspect of this was not critical, but I bring up this case because of its unprecedented agenda and huge budget. The experiences of Rusalka, Nabos, and Mosaic demonstrate this value of conducting large-scale international research. And each case faced its own unique challenges related to logistics, politics, unexpected circumstances like the pandemic. But these examples highlight the significance of building camaraderie and mutual understanding that also play a role in improving international relations, or at least provide a channel for dialogue during periods of heightened tensions and conflict. I'm not going to talk so much about the Arctic Council. I think in this audience, many are aware of the Arctic Council, but just to briefly mention that it's been an instrument for science cooperation and science diplomacy, especially a negotiation of the 2017 agreement on strengthening international Arctic science cooperation, where the U.S. and Russia played key roles in the negotiation of that agreement. So I want to talk a little bit about the current situation. Right now, we're witnessing a severing of state-to-state cooperation after Russia's military actions in Ukraine. Right up until February 24th of last year, there was effective circumpolar cooperation across several institutions and frameworks, including the Arctic Council. Even just the day before, on February 23rd, Russia's ambassador to Norway read an opening speech written by the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov at the Kirkenes conference in the Norwegian Arctic. And in the speech, he mentioned mutual assistance and good neighborly relations in the Arctic and complimented the Kirkenes conference as a setting for constructive and depoliticized discussion of the pressing issues of international cooperation. At the end of February, several parties to the Arctic Council, including indigenous peoples representatives, made known their positions on the situation in Ukraine, on the need for continuing cooperation in light of tensions. The Russian section of the Sami Council, for example, said that now more than ever, the Sami people in Russia need international support to continue cooperation between the Sami of the four countries. So after 7 of the 8 Arctic Council states boycotted Russia's chairmanship in March of last year, the Russian senior Arctic official Nikolai Korchunov called the pause regrettable and warned that it would pose risks and challenges to soft security. Korchunov stressed that Arctic cooperation should not be subject to the spillover effect of any extra-regional events. He said that it is of utmost importance to safeguard the project activities of the Arctic Council in order to be able to pick up where we paused and step up cooperation. So I want to share just some of these official reactions from the Russian side in this situation. And then there's also this fear now that Russia, having been crowded out from cooperation with the West, is now increasingly looking to the East and non-Arctic states. Nikolai Korchunov, Russia's Arctic official, also said it's difficult to imagine Arctic cooperation without the participation in Russia, and that Russia remains open to cooperation, including with non-Arctic states. So we see Russia especially looking to China, and this is part of a larger trend that's been going on for years, especially since February of last year. Russian diplomats have started to engage with states of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Commonwealth of Independent States, the Middle East, Turkey, India, Africa, and others. And so this is one of the consequences of the pause on the Arctic Council, that Russia is being brought closer to the strategic competitors of the U.S., such as China. So China's role in the Arctic may have positive or negative effects, but it must be said that China's cooperation with Russia is still ambiguous. There was the famous case of the arrest of the president of Russia's Arctic Academy of Sciences, Valery Mitko. He was arrested for allegedly sharing secrets with China, and there is this hype around the Polar Silk Road, but there hasn't been shipping from the Chinese Overseas Shipping Company along the Northern Sea Route since February of last year. I know there's a lot of hype around Russia-China cooperation, but I want to stress that this partnership is still ambiguous, but we still see signs of significant Russia-China Arctic cooperation. Outside of the science sphere, the U.S. Coast Guard encountered Chinese and Russian warships operating together close to Alaska last year. And though China is not mentioned in Russia's new naval doctrine, in the 2015 doctrine, the development of friendly ties with China is seen as a key component of national maritime policy. One particularly interesting example of Russia-China convergence on the Arctic was that at the Arctic Circle Assembly in October 2022, China's special Arctic envoy, Feng Gao, said that China would not support Norway's Arctic Council chairmanship if Russia was banned from the process. Feng Gao criticized the interruption of international cooperation in the Arctic due to geopolitical competition and confrontation. There's also the example of the Snowflake International Science Stations in the Russian Arctic, which were expected to launch at the end of 2024. And we're supposed to be a hub for international research, but it now seems to be also be developing into another Russia-China collaboration. So these are just a few examples of Russia now looking to China after the pause of the Arctic Council. So now we can start thinking about what gaps are there in this current freeze, and what areas are there for science cooperation, perhaps for track 2 diplomacy or other forms of dialogue. What areas of dialogue are possible with Russia? We're starting to think about a period of cooperation after the pause of the Arctic Council. From the Russian side, it's interesting to hear that Nikolai Korchinov, Russia's Arctic official, said that since dialogue with Russia has stopped, Arctic Council member states have not proposed creating alternative formats because they see the situation as temporary. This is good news because there was a fear from some experts that Russia or the 7 other Arctic states would create their own Arctic regional institutions without the other party, but this is now seen as a low possibility. We also heard an optimistic view on this from Ambassador David Balton, who still sees cooperation with Russia as possible for a peaceful and cooperative Arctic. But in the meanwhile, when state-to-state cooperation is no longer possible, non-state actors such as researchers and perhaps many of you in the audience will play a particularly important role right now in a form of circumpolar cooperation. So though government level science may be restricted, there is some opportunities for cooperation at the individual level, but of course it's laden with obstacles. Special attention can be paid to synergies that exist between the National Science Foundation's Navigating the New Arctic Agenda and the program's focus on knowledge co-production with indigenous peoples, as well as Russia's Arctic Council chairmanship agenda's focus on indigenous peoples and scientific and cultural exchanges with indigenous knowledge holders. So Russia will soon come to the conclusion of its Arctic Council chairmanship, but during this period, there was particular stress on working with indigenous knowledge holders. And so research communities, including scholars at this webinar, should really prioritize working with indigenous knowledge holders, not least because of their unique circumpolar organizations that go beyond national borders and could be an avenue for international science cooperation at the international person-to-person level. The Bering Strait is also an area for particular successful cooperation. It's been supported by the State Department and Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs before this period. There's long-standing shared cultural heritage between Alaska and Chukotka. So collaborations with this cultural aspect may be less likely to face the national security concerns that we saw that got in the way of past examples of U.S. Russia collaboration. U.S. Russia maritime safety cooperation is also still maintained here in the Bering Strait since February of last year. And this involves the areas of search and rescue, oil spill response, law enforcement, and the management of fisheries. But joint exercises between the U.S. and Russian coast guards are on pause. Likewise, Norway has paused nuclear safety cooperation with Russia, but there is still a contact channel related to emergency preparedness and information sharing. So this shows that there are certain critical cooperation areas that can be maintained. And so this same concern could be extended to climate change and environmental security cooperation. And if not, then perhaps, as is the view of many in the Arctic cooperation community, the states can be pressured by civil society and Arctic residents and non-governmental organizations to restart cooperation because of the threats of the climate crisis. This started in the Cold War, but even in the 1990s, NGOs were particularly influential in affecting national authorities to look at the urgency of nuclear safety in the Arctic. Today, these groups and NGOs, civil societies, operate under very difficult political circumstances, such as restrictions on Russian organizations from working with foreign partners. But this is just something that we could start thinking about in the future period. So to conclude, restarting cooperation is important to restore Arctic cooperation in the context of the breakdown of relations between Russia and the 7 Arctic states. It's important to consider that citizen and science diplomacy is still relevant today, but perhaps not at the government-to-government level, but at the non-state actor level between researchers, indigenous peoples, NGOs, scholars, and civil societies. They may play an important role in non-state level cooperation and perhaps influencing states to reignite intergovernmental cooperation, and that there are important lessons that we can learn from the Cold War, not least from government-to-government cooperation, but also how such non-state actors influenced the US and USSR to have cooperation over mutual interests related to environmental protection and climate change. So that's it for my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Pavel. If we could give Pavel a virtual round of applause. I'm now going to ask Katya to come on and give our second presentation, and then we will move to question and answer with Pavel and Katya afterwards. Over to you, Katya.
All right, thank you so much, and I hope you can hear me clearly. So, right, give me just a second. I'm gonna share one of the presentation that I would like to talk about today as well. So thank you so much, Pavel, for this wonderful presentation and sharing your knowledge about the U.S. Russia cooperation in the North. And also thank you, Victoria, for inviting me here and also to share some knowledge about the Arctic issues and the Arctic science as well. So again, my name is Uryupova. I'm representing the Arctic Institute here today. And also I'm an active scientist, so I spent quite a lot of time in the fields in both polar regions. So for me, it's a very familiar environment, working environment. So I do spend quite a lot of time working on board of research vessels as well, and on the land at the research bases. And today I just would like to share some thoughts about the current situation, about science diplomacy, how it works in the Arctic, about what is happening in terms of tensions and how it impacts marine research and all the scientific activities in the Arctic. I would love to give you a broader picture of the situation, and I just want to mention a few things that probably you are familiar with, but anyway, that would be good to mention them here in this presentation as well. So when we talk about the Arctic region, so we think that it's just a cold and hostile destination, but it's a lot of things happening in this region. And the Arctic region is rapidly changing as a result of climate alteration and also on the impact of political tensions. And we have some Arctic and non-Arctic states, they actively do quite a lot of things here and carry out a lot of projects. So the Arctic region is characterized by vast distances, harsh climate, limited infrastructure, to be honest, and communication challenges. And of course, we have some economic activities happening here in this area, and we harvest quite a lot of living marine resources. Due to climate change and development of the Arctic region as a result of the depletion of deposits of mineral resources in other parts of the world, new natural resources have become available for utilization, and new Arctic areas are opening for commercial activities, and including some maritime activities and some naval exercises as well. So in general, we see the Arctic region as area of unique international cooperation. And of course, we always mention this should be an area of low tension activity. If you look at this slide, you can see that there are a lot of lines, and this is how we imagine the Arctic region. So, but in general, the Arctic Circle would be the major line for many international organizations. And inside of this circle, we can find quite a lot of water. Basically, it's the ocean surrounded by land. And on land, we have many nations and we have indigenous peoples. So Arctic is a polar region located in the northernmost part of Earth, but it's not that hostile as we can imagine. So it's mostly consists of the Arctic Ocean, adjacent seas, and parts of northern countries. And when we start to talk about the activities in the Arctic, it would be nice to mention also about the exclusive economic zones, because all the commercial activities, all the military drills, they somehow cover these areas as well. So 5 surrounding Arctic countries are limited to territorial sea. It's about 12 nautical miles, or about 22 kilometers or 14 miles. And we have exclusive economic zones. When we mention this term, we should think about 200 nautical miles. It's about 370 kilometers and 230 miles, something like that. So these areas or areas of the sea adjusting to the coasts of the areas and Council as the leading intergovernmental forum promoting cooperation, coordination, and interaction among the Arctic states. Also important to mention that in the Arctic Council, we have quite a lot of scientific activities, and we have permanent participants, and we have some scientific groups working hard on and studying some impacts of climate change, pollution, and other aspects. And of course, we have quite extensive field of international cooperation in the Arctic. We have many regional forums. We have regional system of fisheries management here in the Arctic and adjacent seas. We have quite a lot of organization and agreements. They also work hard to keep cooperation working. We have quite intense transport connectivity in this area and a very well working search and rescue coordination system. And of course, we have quite a lot of research activities happening in the region. My favorite examples would be for sure, and successful examples, international cooperation on the Arctic search and rescue in this area. And you can see it's very well designed and well working still under these very challenging times. And of course, I like to talk about fisheries a lot because this is part of my expertise as well. And we have a potential for successful cooperation on fisheries in this region. In my opinion, fisheries is one of the most important activities in the Arctic. It's about fish stocks, it's about jobs, it's all about investments and businesses, and it's about climate change as well. And we definitely have to learn from it. Even now, when we have so many tensions, including area covering the Arctic Ocean, so we still have some agreements working. For example, the parties who signed the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreements in the previous years, and among those countries are Canada, Iceland, Denmark, United States, Russian Federation, Norway, China, Japan, South Korea, and the European Union as an independent entity. They successfully completed the first conference of the parties when they met in South Korea in November 2022. It happened already after the beginning of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. So it means the agreement and the cooperation is working well. And another example covering the topic of fisheries and cooperation in this area would be the Norwegian-Russian Joint Fishery Commission. This commission meets regularly and shows agreement on fish quotas in the northern waters. So, and another thing when we talk about scientific cooperation, of course, now it's very much a challenging time. It was challenging also for everyone during the COVID-19 pandemic, and we are still recovering from this time because during this time we had very little activity happening in this area. And then the funding was lost, and then other things happened. And now cooperation is almost on hold because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but it works somehow. And we have some positive examples as well. And one of the ways to cooperate in the Arctic would be focus on environmental protection and conservation in this area. For example, establishment of marine protected areas in the Arctic. That's a very important topic to cover as well. And I think this example is worth mentioning here. But of course, when we talk about the Arctic, it's not only about the cooperation, but also about some challenges. As soon as I spent quite a lot of time working on board of research ships and all kind of vessels, so I noticed that sometimes it's very, very challenging process, specifically when you apply for permits and when you navigate in some very specific areas. So Arctic constitutes the region which is transformed by environmental and geopolitical change. And honestly, it has become the terrain for difficult international negotiations. The search for peaceful and sustainable governance of the Arctic is in itself a difficult objective to establish. In the Arctic, it's not that easy because the system of governance is not like in Antarctica. There is no Antarctic Treaty here, and there is no Arctic Treaty working here in the north. So that's why we have to deal with regional management and very much focused national governance or some regional governance examples. So the changing climate and advancing technology have also created a new environments and resultant impetus for increased activity in the northern waters because the waters are opening, we have less sea ice, and more activities are possible in this area. So due to these changes, the Arctic is rapidly becoming a new frontier of strategic importance for many countries. Nowadays, we can see the increased military presence here as well, and it's fostering some interesting changes in the high north. So the Arctic is a region in which competition is reflected and exacerbated, and by visibly demonstrating military activities, they intend to remain engaged and not cede military, economic, or political advantage is demonstrated in this area. According to some sources, a number of Western-led military exercises have significantly grown in the European Arctic area, with participation of non-Arctic states since 2006. And the analysis between 2006 and 2020 showed that more than 20 European countries from beyond the Arctic region have been involved in at least one of these joint exercises on land or at sea during this period. So, which is pretty much a lot for this peaceful region. And recently, I published one of the analysis, and here you can see on this slide, this is my recent paper, published in 2023. Here I'm discussing different aspects of the interaction between naval operations and scientific and commercial activities, mostly fisheries in the Arctic region. And so I tried to analyze different aspects of militarization in this region and positive and negative impact of naval operations in this area. And again, when we come back to this slide, so the Arctic Ocean and the region itself is subject to a number of governance systems. Military drills may pose a challenge to various activities in the Arctic region, including fisheries, cruise tourism, and other activities like research projects. All nations have an absolute right under international law to conduct military activities beyond the territorial sea of another nation. Also, there is a stipulation in maritime law that allows a warship to cross into another country's maritime territory legally. When it comes to the Arctic region, all countries must be informed about military exercises in accordance with international standards and agreements. Also here we have the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Seas when we talk about the open waters. And this is a comprehensive treaty that creates a legal regime governing the peaceful use of the ocean and its resources. So the convention provides recommendations on different maritime matters, such as environmental protection, pollution, and resources rights. However, it does not clearly cover issues concerning military operations and the use of force in the oceans. So, and according to this convention, civilian ships, for example, research vessels, are allowed to navigate inside exclusive economic zones only with prior agreement or approval. So it means research vessels, cruise ships, and other civilian ships, they have to apply for a permit to enter those specific zones very, very much in advance. So, but you also have to understand when we plan some research activities in this area, in the Arctic, it's very expensive activity. This is the first thing. And usually those activities, they're planned very much ahead, few years ahead. So, of course, we can apply for specific permits to carry out some research activities in specific areas, which are interesting for science. But again, if there are some military activities in this area, there is something about the conflict of interest already. Talking about the notices, when the military activities they happen in this area. So usually the military notices about the drills, exercises, whatever, they appear a few months ahead, but sometimes 2 weeks ahead. For the research activities, it's already critical. 2 weeks ahead, we already at sea, basically. We probably start our expedition. We can't change our plans because this is the area of our interest, and we have to take a sample from this specific area. And when we have this conflict between military drills and research expeditions in the area, it means a lot for the research community. But why I'm talking about this growing in number of military activities happening in the region? Because we have a lot of tensions. And even taking into account that the Arctic region is a low tensions region, anyway, we have noticed that the interest to the area is growing, and the military activities are growing in number as well. So it means we have there's interference between different activities that we have in this region. And also, I discuss in my paper some of the specific aspects, what kind of activities interfere with the military drills. And specifically, I focus on field research. And here on the slide, you can also see that some of the activities happened in 2021. Before the Russia-Ukraine conflict, they already had, they already took place in this area that moment. And in 2021, and just to remember again, it was the period of recovery after the pandemic. We had so many military drills happening in this area, which is very interesting. So it means they definitely interfered with some research projects and our plans to bring more scientists in the field to the Arctic. And of course, we have some other activities happening in the region. For example, polar tourism. We have quite a lot of cruise ships, and they provide the opportunity to travel in these beautiful, stunning places, and also to enjoy and see this beautiful nature. But when we have more military activities happening in this area, like military drills or large exercises, so those activities are not possible. So we are not able to plan these activities, or we have to change our itineraries dramatically, which is about the expenses, which is about the change of plans. And sometimes it's a critical change, for example, for research vessels or fishery vessels. We are not able to change the itinerary because we need to get to the specific location to get a sample, for example. I'm talking also about the exploration fishery, when we study some stocks and collect some samples from the fields about the fish species. So we send some fishery vessels in the fields, and we focused mostly on collecting data. It's not about commercial harvest of fish, but still we call these fishery activities. And with some changes in the area, specifically impacted by the climate change. So we can see that we also observe some changes in the area of the distribution of fish species. And according to this change, we also need to study more and more and collect some data to project some possibilities to harvest some fish from new areas, and also to try to find a way how to manage these areas, because these are new areas for us, because fish start to easily start to migrate to new locations under new climatic conditions. And of course, that may bring some new changes to the governance. But again, talking about this very important agreements on Central Arctic Ocean that was signed in 2018 and working since 2021. So we have already had the first meeting of all the signatories of this agreement. But we know that this agreement will be in use only for 16 years. And after this moment, we either reapply and re-sign this document, or we have to decide what to do. And interesting that, for example, United States and Russia, they are still adhering to the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, but they already started to think how to manage these areas if this agreement will not be in use after a few years, when the agreement will not work anymore. So this is about the future of cooperation or maybe more tensions. And of course, talking about the tourism itself. So sending some cruise ships in this area and also bringing some visitors to this area, it's very important because we also share some knowledge about the polar regions. And on board of these vessels, we also carry out some projects which we call citizen science projects, when we ask travelers to help scientists to collect some data from the field. So when we have less touristic activities happening in this area because of interference with military drills and exercises, so again, the results of this interference would be less data collected from the field. But of course, we have to be on a positive wave. And of course, the future of the Arctic cooperation is pretty much bright because we have so many agreements working. We have still so many ways to cooperate and how to develop this. So let's see how it works. But I think the future for sure, it's about the science diplomacy. And we have to talk to each other and try to find a way how to build new bridges to each other. And of course, to think and analyze, do we need so many military activities and exercises in the area, or should we focus mostly on research activities or some exploration activities in the area? Because the conflict is existing in this area. So thank you so much. I hope it's not that long.
That was perfect. Thank you so much, Katya, for that incredibly insightful presentation. I know I was taking a lot of notes. I am now going to bring Pavel back up and have our question and answer. We have about 20 minutes. So if you have not already put your questions in the chat box, please do so now. We are going to start off with two questions from Tom, one for Pavel and one for Katya. So for Pavel, Tom wants to know, do you think environmental and science diplomacy can be prioritized to the states over potential security tensions? And for Katya, Tom wants to know, I know it's a symbolic term, but would you say there is potential for a new Cold War in the Arctic? Pavel, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, thank you very much, Tom, for that question. Yeah, it gets right to the heart of what we're all talking about. I think in short, no, there won't be environmental and science diplomacy prioritized by the states over the potential security tensions, at least not in these circumstances, not foreseeable during especially the Biden administration. There was the announcement from the White House of a ban on all scientific interaction with Russian institutions. This was several months after February of last year. So, I mean, in my presentation and my research, my main thesis is that state level science diplomacy is very hard to imagine, but we can start thinking about non-state level cooperation or planning for a post-war period. But there was a brief moment where we did think that the war would not affect the situation. Um, I remember, I think it was February 25th or 26th or so, when John Kerry, who's serving as Biden's climate change envoy, said that he had a hope that Putin would stay on track in combating climate change. And of course, this got lots of criticism from Republican pundits. But after that, I'm pretty sure he walked his message back. But the idea is that there's still a sentiment that the climate crisis is very important, and the reason why we focus on that and not other areas of cooperation in our presentations, other areas of cooperation like polar shipping or energy extraction or natural resources, is because of this mutual interest and this common threat of the climate emergency. But in short, I don't think environmental and science diplomacy can be prioritized in the short run. But thank you, Tom.
So yes, and if I may also reply to Tom about his question about the possible or new Cold War in the Arctic, I don't think so, because now we have so many ways to communicate and we do not stop to communicate that. And I think the scientific community is so strong, and the everyday perception of regular people and how we can do something positive together, I think that is much stronger nowadays than it was before. So that's why we are in a better position right now, I think. And just from my personal perception, I travel a lot and I hear so many different opinions from people from different nations, and there is no single opinion that everyone just want to be against Russia or against the United States, because everyone understands that we have some global issues like the climate change, and we have to deal with that. So it's more important than anything else. For sure, political tensions, they impact quite a lot all kind of activities. But for example, fisheries is a perfect example. It works well, and we still agree on quotas. We still agree where to fish and how to do this. We have some local tensions, fishery tensions between different nations, but it does not mean that it's about a Cold War. I don't think so. The scientific community, the community of science diplomats, I think nowadays it's much stronger and they can do some positive things.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you both for those answers. We have another question, one for Pavel and one for Katya from Joshua. So Joshua wants to know from you, Pavel, what is the significance of the fact that the Arctic Council and climate and environmental protection have lost so much importance in the updated Russian Arctic strategy? What are the consequences for future scientific cooperation in the Arctic? And for you, Katya, Joshua wants to know, is the increasing militarization hindering the process of restoring scientific cooperation in the Arctic today?
Yeah, this is a very good question. Thank you, Joshua, because there's been a lot of talk about how the Arctic Council has lost its role in Russia's Arctic strategy. This year, there was an update of Russia's official Arctic strategy that removed this discussion of multilateral cooperation within the framework of the Arctic Council and replaced that with bilateral cooperation. So that's the main thing that that Russia will see Arctic cooperation at the bilateral level. But what's interesting and was not widely discussed in Western media reporting on this update was that there was another article of Russia's Arctic strategy that called the Arctic Council as the main institution for cooperation in the region, and this part was not removed from the Arctic strategy. So that's not to say that the Arctic Council has been completely removed from Russia's Arctic strategy. That would be inaccurate to say that, but that cooperation will now be at the bilateral level, and also the language of cooperation with foreign states as opposed to non-Arctic states, as it was written in the previous strategy. So foreign states, which could refer to countries like China or India, other states not in the Arctic Circle. So science cooperation will definitely involve China more. In my presentation, I talked about this example of the Snowflake International Research Station. I mentioned it because it was lauded as this great example of Russia welcoming international researchers to its Arctic to jointly research the region in the areas of environmental protection and climate change. But it now seems to also be developing as a Russia-China collaborative project, especially after Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow this year. There's been a lot of discussion of management of the Northern Sea Route and Arctic development. I don't think science cooperation was explicitly mentioned after his recent visit to Moscow, but these are all connected, of course. And the consequences of this for science, for science cooperation in the Arctic, from a U.S. perspective, and probably hear from my accent, I'm speaking as an American, so I care about U.S. security and the U.S. role in global science. We have to think about what is the impact of crowding out Russia from the Arctic Council and pushing it closer to the strategic competitors of the U.S. like China. After Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, China canceled its bilateral dialogue on climate change with the U.S. So at so many levels, the U.S. and China are distancing from each other, and China is getting closer with Russia. And so here's another situation where a consequence of Russia being crowded out from the Arctic Council and interstate Arctic cooperation will have this impact of allowing China to play a bigger role in the Arctic. And actually, this is not a value judgment. It doesn't necessarily mean that China is a threat in the Arctic. They could also play an important role in climate change research in the Arctic, especially. But I understand it's a big concern for U.S. policymakers. Thank you, Joshua.
All right. So I also want to raise my hand and also to add some of the notes. So first of all, about Arctic strategies. So I agree only partly. And I would say that all the Arctic strategies of all the countries, they include this term international cooperation. If we stop to cooperate, then we just don't use our Arctic strategies anymore. So then countries should understand what they want more, either to continue with the political tensions or continue to develop their Arctic strategies and follow the plan. That's the first thing. And again, talking about Russia and their Arctic strategy, it's a quite an extensive document that was released a few years ago, and it will be in work until 2035. And I would say that the environmental element there is pretty much strong in comparison to the previous Arctic strategies of Russia. For example, there's a huge program to remove all the old equipment from all the bases in the Arctic. Have been working for many years in the Arctic, and I could see this my eyes in the field how all the scrap metal was removed from the areas. This is a huge improvement, and this absolutely massive effort. Something is happening, and it's for good. for sure. So, and talking about the scientific cooperation, of course, nowadays it's about challenging times. So we have kind of a conflict and we can feel it. We can watch this on TV when we watch news. And since 2022, we have been observing increasing tension in the north, unfortunately, while scientific cooperation is significantly decreasing. Unfortunately, our Russian scientists, they are not able to travel anymore to some of the areas of the Arctic to collect some data. And also a scientific exchange between countries mostly like stopped. We have stopped to talk to many experts and exchange valuable scientific information. And it's sadly and suddenly some of my colleagues, experts with long experience working in the Arctic, they are not able to travel, not able to communicate with other scientists, and to be a part of many, many exciting projects about the North. But when we talk about this ban on communication with some scientists from different countries, so basically it's a punishment, but we punish not only one country or nation. It's a punishment for all the humanity, because if we collect some data about the climate change, it's about the global science. We stop to do this because we have no access to some of the areas, territories, or we don't want to communicate with some of scientists. They have extensive databases and so on and so on. We just punish ourselves. And I think this is a little bit silly from one side. And we think we have to think about this for the future. Otherwise, knowledge will be lost because we do not protect this knowledge at all. And unfortunately, it's happening right now. But I think there is a bright future for some cooperation because we still have some connection. We still have some bridges. And the more we put some efforts and our time to strengthen those connections, the more we will have in the future.
Thank you. Some inspiring words for the future, which leads us to our next question from Marco in Italy. What may be the problems if the current Arctic Council situation continues for many more years? What is the role for science diplomacy in this scenario to try to resolve this division? This is for both of you, and because we have 5 questions in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to also pull in another question about who the non-state researchers in Russia are from. So again, the future of the Arctic Council.
Thanks for those questions. Absolutely. I think that, like, just to carry on what Katya was saying, is that there's the problem of the loss of data from 50% of the Arctic coastline by excluding Russia, not being able to compare notes, and also, so data loss from the Russian Arctic, and vice versa, data loss from the Western Arctic from a Russian scientist's perspective. Russian expertise in permafrost as well. Russia has excellent centuries-long expertise in studying permafrost, the icebreaker vessels as well. So this synergy of capabilities in Arctic research, that's what's lost. So the role that science diplomacy can play in this is diplomacy for science, where diplomats work to find the gaps for cooperation, but this is perhaps not foreseeable during the Biden administration, at least. Scientists, for example, I saw in my article, I quoted how scientists who participated in the Mosaic project said that tensions over the current conflict cripple Arctic research. They said that if we limit access to the Russian Arctic, we'll miss some of the most important insights to better understand how and why the Arctic system is changing. And that's an excellent question from Alexei about who are these non-state researchers in Russia. So non-state actors in general includes scholars, indigenous peoples, non-governmental organizations, and civil societies. But in Russia, any of these groups who would get money from foreign sources would be called foreign agents. So they face lots of difficult circumstances in this, in trying to collaborate with partners abroad. And it's true that most researchers get money from the state, whether they work for state-backed institutions or universities funded by the state. Researchers that get money from foreign sources are also called foreign agents. So, I highlight cooperation at the non-state level, which is not necessarily between state apparatuses, but cooperation between researchers or indigenous peoples' representations or non-governmental organizations will find lots of difficulties. And then it's kind of it comes to Galadriel's question about practical avenues for cooperation at this level. There are certain examples of conferences and events that allow both sides of researchers to collaborate. One example is the Kalat Academy in Finland. There was also the USC, that's the University of Southern California National Science Foundation conference in Washington, D.C. last year that invited Russian professors to talk about environmental issues of the Arctic. There's also the opportunities to co-author papers, to have joint webinars like this, to share research at the individual level, to share data, but that all comes with risks, and it's individuals who make those decisions, or individual institutions as well.
Yes, I absolutely agree with Pavel, because I think there is some tendency. So we have some challenging things happening, but also there are some bright things happening. And there is also one question about what is the future of scientific research and cooperation in Svalbard. I just want to answer briefly. So I do visit Svalbard quite a lot every season, summer season, I mean. And there are, if you probably know, there are a few different scientific stations distributed there from different nations. And also Russian Institute of Arctic and Antarctic, they represent themselves there, and they do some studies of permafrost, of fishery, fish stocks, and so on and so on. From the recent news that I heard, that there is a huge program to develop the Russian scientific base in this area as well. For the next year, it's a huge plan. So the focus will be on science and tourism in this area. So, and I believe so other nations, they will represent themselves on Svalbard as they do right now.
Thank you so much. We have a few more questions. The next is from Anna, who asks, what do you think are the perspectives for U.S. Russia cooperation on environmental safety measures regarding deep sea mining over the next few years for both of our speakers?
That's a good question. So as I know, there is still some cooperation happening on this regard. But we will see, because for me, this question is still not clear and still open, because as you know, the United States, they are not among the signatories of the Convention of the Sea, of the Law of the Sea. So, and then it makes everything a little bit more challenging for the future.
Yeah, I don't know the specifics of deep sea mining, but there's definitely need for the regulation of it. This is an area for science diplomacy, that scientists are involved in crafting these regulations, similar to how Russian scientists submitted claims to the Arctic seabed to the United Nations Commission on the Continental Shelf. And this was a process that's been going on for decades. And just this year, Russia's claims based on data submitted by scientists was approved by the United Nations. So definitely regulations on deep sea mining will involve science diplomacy.
Thank you both. Definitely a topic to look out for. We have two more questions. The next from Galadriel for Pavel, asking, considering that the vast majority of researchers are to an extent dependent on their home state policies, most notably in terms of funding, what do you imagine in terms of practical avenues for cooperation at the researchers level? And then finally, for Katya from Kanagavali, what do you think the future of scientific research and cooperation is on Svalbard? Where do you see this going?
Thanks for that. Yeah, so I mentioned it a bit earlier about how there are some settings for cooperation at the researcher level, like conferences and events that still invite, so for example, Western conferences that still invite Russian researchers, Russian conferences that invite Western researchers. There was a recent conference in Yakutia, I believe, that had Western scientists, including from the U.S., present on permafrost thaw. And so permafrost and the study of permafrost thaw is a great expertise in Russian science. So it's worth it to have research sharing in that area. And beyond that, co-authoring papers and having joint webinars and sharing research at this individual level is something that can still go on.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. And I think that there are still some channels of funding for some of the projects, because when we usually apply for some of the grants, so we do this a few years ahead, and usually the funding covers few years as well. So to cut this funding so easily, some of the projects, they still have an access to those funding. So it gives a hope that maybe we can extend this and we can use it a little bit later when we can travel again, when we can share some knowledge, or we can basically support some exchange between scientists from different countries. For sure, this is the challenging time for everyone, but anyway, all the bad times, they come to end some point, and there are some initiative groups or groups of scientists that really support some specific areas of research, or they still want to collaborate because they're dependent on the equipment, they're dependent on some of the databases, so they cooperate to each other, they continue to do this no matter what. And talking about Svalbard, I already replied to this question before.
Thank you so much for both of those answers, and thank you both to Pavel and to Katya for two incredible presentations today. If everyone could please give a virtual round of applause for sharing so much research and insights into science diplomacy, past, present, and future in the Arctic. We will be sharing a recording of this webinar later today, along with publications from Pavel and Katya. We hope to see you at the next research webinar that we will be hosting next Tuesday, May 7th, on the One Health approach to zoonotic diseases in the Arctic, hosted by the Migration and Harmony Research Coordination Network and the Arctic Institute. Thank you again, Katya and Pavel. Thank you for everyone who joined us across Asia, Europe, and the Americas. We hope to see you next week. That is all from us for today. Thank you all so much for